record this session. Mr. Plant has approved of that. We have a couple other folks who might like to see it later on and share it with villages. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Susan Reardon, who is part of our program committee. Susan helps to plan these wonderful events we have every month. And again, everybody's welcome to come. We have websites for our villages to get more information, and I'm going to turn it over to Susan so she can introduce our speaker and we can get started. So thanks everybody again for being here, and I hope you enjoy the program.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Jan, and it's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce Bill Plant. I'm sure many of you, like me, have seen Bill over the years. He's been with CBS, or he was with CBS for 52 years before he retired. And Bill, the full time was with CBS, so you sort of stuck with the guy that brought you. So that is quite remarkable. He has been an eyewitness to history, and not only that, but he's been an Emmy Award winning reporter. He has seen 4 tours of duty in Vietnam. He saw the civil rights marches and covered the civil rights era, was in Selma during that time, and was the senior White House correspondent during the terms of Reagan, Bush, Obama, and Clinton. And so has seen an awful lot of history, and has been at the center of it all through journalism, which is an incredibly important part of our lives as well. And I know when you gave us a talk to the Georgetown Village, it was about fake news, which really characterized what was going on. We probably still have a little bit of that going on now, but we hopefully are in a different era. And we really welcome your thoughts and comments about journalism in today's world. So without any further ado, Bill, thank you so much. It's an honor for you to be here.
Well, Susan, thank you very much, and thanks to all 3 villages for coming out. I'm delighted to be with you, and delighted to have a chance to talk about this. Yeah, I did spend 52 years at CBS News, 32 of them covering the White House, and here's my headline: fake news isn't over yet, because the way that we communicate information has totally changed over the period in which I was working, and it isn't going to go back. So let's talk about it a little bit. Things have calmed down a bit since the election and the inauguration and the riot, but the chaos of the period that we've just been through certainly invites a look at how to make sense of things going forward. I mean, I think often about how much has changed in my working life. When I started to cover the Reagan White House in 1981, the news every night at 6:30 on CBS, NBC, and ABC was what we said it was. You didn't have much other choice to find out what was going on. And when I started in this business, we took ourselves very seriously. The major news organizations, including the networks, believed that they had the responsibility to tell people what they needed to know. And there was no one with any real reach or influence to say otherwise. Example, when Ed Murrow reported from London, a rooftop during the Blitz, when a young David Brinkley told the nation that FDR had died at Warm Springs, when Walter Cronkite announced that JFK was dead in Dallas, they spoke to a nation which, by and large, trusted what they had to say. But today, people can choose their own news to suit their convictions, and they do. So the need for carefully sourced and reported news is greater than ever. The news comes to us in a cacophony of voices from everywhere: radio, television, newspapers, the internet, Twitter, Facebook. It's a confusing mashup of fact and opinion, and that makes it very difficult to know what is true and what is not. President Trump tweeted, The fake news media is the enemy of the American people. That is a sentiment which previously had not been heard in democracies. But press bashing and the use of news as a political weapon began long before the Trump administration. The press has been a thorn in the side of every president since the founding of the republic. In the colonies, in the early years of the nation, the press referred to a wide variety of partisan newspapers. They were usually devoted to one politician or another, and they were often vicious in their treatment of enemies. The colonial press, in other words, was the internet of its time, full of lies and slander and vicious character assassination. In the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson was accused in one paper of running a Congo harem at Monticello. John Adams was accused of smuggling in British prostitutes to serve his perverted desires. Talk about fake news. Then the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791, but the affirmation of freedom of speech in the new First Amendment did not stop the Adams administration from passing the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. The Alien Act allowed the president to deport foreigners he thought dangerous. And the Sedition Act outlawed false statements about the government. Does this sound familiar? Do I hear fake news? Remember what Mark Twain wrote. Mark Twain said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." Several editors were fined and sent to jail before the Sedition Act expired in 1801. Jefferson campaigned against the Alien and Sedition Acts. He pardoned those who were still serving sentences when he took office in 1801, but his biographer, Dumas Malone, says that before the act expired, Jefferson had prosecuted several of his own critics under the Sedition Act. Jefferson's attitude toward the press was all over the place. Philosophically, he embraced the idea that a free press was necessary, vitally necessary to self-government. He famously declared that we're left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government. I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. But as time went on, he was very vexed by the press. In 1803, when he was president, he said, "Our newspapers, for the most part, present only the caricatures of disaffected minds." Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln was a young rising politician, he wrote letters to the editor demeaning other politicians and signed phony names. They were published by his favorite publishers. When he was president, he arrested editors who supported the Confederacy, and he suspended habeas corpus. The idea of holding news to objective fact rather than the politics of the paper's owner didn't really take effect until the early 20th century. But that has never stopped politicians from putting their own best spin on things, from being, as we used to say, economical with the truth. I mean, from the founding of the nation until long after the advent of broadcasting, most people got their news from newspapers. But beginning in the early 60s, after the assassination of JFK, television began to be the dominant medium through which people got their news. And in those days, we reporters had hours, sometimes all day, to develop a story. We still had to fight to get the stories on the air or in print, of course. 22 minutes on the evening news was all that was left after the commercials. There was no 24/7 cable coverage all the time, as there is now. But conflicts over time for news on space on the broadcast airwaves emerged shortly after journalism began to take place shortly after World War II. Journalists wanted more time. Managers wanted advertising dollars. That example is what drove Edward Murrow away from CBS. Over 60 years ago in Chicago, Murrow told the radio TV news directors that radio and TV news were part, in his words, of an incompatible combination of show business, advertising, and news. And when you get all three under one roof, the dust never settles. That's even more true today across all media than it was in 1958. And of course, around the turn of the century, this century, social media became the primary transmitter of news, as loss of advertising revenue caused more than 2,000 newspapers to fold. Back in 1980, Ronald Reagan's manager of images, Mike Deaver, told me, "We're going to go over your heads directly to the American people." Well, that wasn't so easy then, because back in those days, the three networks and the two major wire services set the news agenda on any given day. But fast forward to now, the era of social media, anyone's idle musings can be flashed around the world in seconds. Humor columnist Gene Weingarten of the Washington Post, I'm sure you're familiar with him, once years ago wrote, "Imagine how many more newspapers we could sell if our headlines didn't have to be true." Little did he know, he was way ahead of his time. Onto the idea of what is now called clickbait, internet headlines that are written to get you to open the story, whether they're actually factual or not. Fake news isn't new, but it now spreads with the speed of light, which is what makes it so dangerous. So when the President of the United States said to a group of reporters, "It's frankly disgusting the way the press is able to write what they want to write. People should look into it." Or tweets, "Why do we work so hard in working with the media when it is corrupt?" That was President Trump's method of operation. My colleague Leslie Stahl remembers what happened in an interview with Mr. Trump a day after he was elected in 2016. She said, "He started to attack the press. So I said to him, 'You've won. Why do you keep hammering at this?' And he said, 'You know why I do it? I do it to discredit and demean you all, so that when you write negative stories about me, no one will believe you.'" The ability to communicate on Twitter gave President Trump a platform like no other, and he used it to spread misinformation and lies. The Washington Post's fact checker counted over 30,000 lies or misstatements of fact during his 4 years. And many people believed them, right down to the claims that he had actually won re-election and his attempts to remain in office. Those claims were fueled by news providers who no longer subscribed to the standards of fact-based journalism. And all of this was part of what led to the sense of alienation that inspired the assault on the Capitol building. The fake news that was published convinced people around the country that the coronavirus was overhyped or even made up, and that mask wearing was an infringement on their rights as citizens. Until, of course, it hit them where they lived. But there's even worse news. Fake news is only the beginning of the information credibility problem. There is now a whole debate about the idea of objectivity in news coverage. Can objectivity even exist? It's been the ideal in news coverage for the last century or so, but is there such a thing? I mean, we are all products of our own belief systems and upbringing, of our parents and our schooling. But does that mean that we see the world according to our own prejudices? Am I able, as an 83-year-old white middle-class American, to see the world in the same way as a 25-year-old Black woman or a 40-year-old Native American man? Probably not. But the question has jumped beyond whether I can honestly present the facts despite my own prejudices to a new and different kind of problem in news organizations. And that's this. Maybe you've noticed. There seems to be much more opinion in news columns these days, as opposed to the editorial columns. Does it make you uncomfortable? Does me. You may recall that last summer, a woman named Barry Weiss was writing a column for the New York Times. She resigned from the paper following expressions of outrage by minority staffers on the Times over her writing. Her response was an accusation that her critics were preemptively closing off debate. She said that they didn't regard truth as a process of collective discovery, but an orthodoxy already known to an enlightened few whose job it was to inform everybody else. That's an example of cancel culture, which instead of being open to debate and discussion, tries to shut down opinions that it regards as wrong. I do believe, though, despite all this, that truth can be discovered incrementally. But then the question arises, should the entire burden be on you, the reader, viewer, or listener, to figure out where the truth is? Do you deserve some protections in law or regulation? Facebook, Google, and Amazon have been wrestling with and against regulation for years. Their business models, after all, depend on selling your consumer information, so they are reluctant to impede that in any way. So discerning the truth becomes even more difficult. It becomes very easy to manipulate video. We're in a media environment which does little to separate news from show business and from trivia. Malicious actors have a lot of power. Manipulating video is easy. One example is the clip, which recently showed the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, slurring her words, appearing to be drunk. The video had been edited and slowed down in playback to create that appearance. There's an even more alarming technology available now. You can put words in people's mouths to create a video of a real person saying whatever the video creator wants her or him to say. These are called deep fakes, because they have the real potential to cause chaos. We live in a time when everybody has their own narrative, their own worldview, and their own facts. Trust in institutions has dissolved. People's feelings count more than their thoughts. Conspiracies are accepted as truth. The press, generally, individual reporters particularly, have a lot less credibility than they once did. A Knight Gallup poll of attitudes toward the press finds that a majority believe that inaccurate news is intentional on the part of the reporter, either because the reporter is misrepresenting the facts or because he or she is making them up entirely. Now, it's true, I think, that one of the major dangers of being a reporter in Washington is groupthink. Reporters, after all, are mostly well-educated and well-paid. They cover a government which is supposed to be run for the benefit of the people. And most of them believe that that is generally the case. But most of these professionals were blindsided by the power of the populist message of Trump and others in much of America. We are, most of us, pretty much removed from the circumstances of the people out there who have felt the effects of deindustrialization or jobs shipped overseas, of unfair trade agreements and unstable borders. People who more than anything have felt the failure of politicians to help them. Reminds me of a story that was attributed to Pauline Kael, whom some of you will remember as the famous film critic of the New Yorker magazine. She is supposed to have said, this is one of those sort of too good to be true stories. She is supposed to have said of Richard Nixon's victory in 1968, "I don't understand how that man won. I don't know anybody who voted for him." Well, of course she didn't. The internet and social media have now changed the way that reporters do their jobs. And they have also seduced some reporters into a self-referential popularity contest. I'll say it again because my voice was cracking. A self-referential popularity contest of tweets and likes on Facebook. They become celebrities. Sometimes they comment as opposed to just reporting. And of course, that automatically disposes some readers or viewers not to trust that person. When I was growing up in this business, excuse me, news organizations had a real firewall between reporting and opinion. But now reporting and commentary are often confused, especially on cable TV. People don't make the distinction and we don't help them to make it. Are the people you see on a panel on cable TV reporters? Or are they people invited there because of their points of view, their diverse opinions? Reporters should never be cheerleaders. But that is something that can happen when they get too familiar with a source. And reporters don't do themselves or their audiences any favors when they give into a snarky post on Facebook or Twitter. So what should we be doing? We should be paying more attention to the people who have responded to the populist message, the people who have felt those effects, have felt the failure of the politicians to help them. The answer to fake news is more real news. The craziness can't be allowed to become the new normal. But the danger is that the more it becomes everyday reality, the more normal it is. I mean, is fake news over, as you suggested at the top of our talk today? No. The ex-president is about to go back, have a public speech next Sunday, I think, at CPAC. You'll hear more of it. So where do we begin? One place would be to educate middle school students about history, civics, and media literacy. This is being done in some places, but not nearly enough. There was a Stanford University history education study, which looked at both well-off suburban areas and kids there, who found that there was no reason to believe that just because children seem to know all about technology, that they've learned critical thinking. Because 80% of the middle schoolers who were studied in this could not distinguish news articles from ads labeled sponsored content. Same thing when high school students were shown photos of a double-headed daisy, allegedly the result of a nuclear meltdown. Only 20% of them questioned the lack of information about the picture, where it came from, who said that this is what it was, whose bona fides are we looking at here? So how to make sense of it all? How to begin sorting out the real from the fake? The problem here is that the answer rests individually with each one of us. That makes it tough. But you can't accept what you read or hear and see at face value, particularly if it seems in any way questionable. You have to be skeptical. There was a legendary editor at the City News Bureau of Chicago whose advice to young reporters was, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Use some of the tools that do exist to help you determine what's true and what's not. There's an internet site known as Snopes.com. Snopes, who's named after some of the most twisted characters in William Faulkner's writing, debunks or confirms material that's out there on the net. There's a site called NewsGuard, which rates internet pages according to their record of accuracy and general trustworthiness. It's subscription-based at $2.95 a month, but it's available. Even just looking for confirmation of something that is suspicious or doesn't smell right, looking for confirmation on a few different sites may help. It helps too, I think, if each of us is aware of our own biases. Approaching this is understanding that putting together a news story involves deciding what to emphasize and what to leave out. Some will prefer the approach of the New York Times. Others will prefer the approach of a Washington Times. Yes, there's a new administration now, doing business in a much more different low-key style. But it is inevitable, I guarantee you, that at some point, the administration's desire to keep embarrassing news secret will collide with the reporter's scoop. And there will be a problem. There was in every administration that I covered, often more than once. Freedom of speech can never be taken for granted. It is true that as a nation, this isn't the first time we've been split like this, at odds with one another. We were during the Civil Rights Movement, during the Depression, during the Civil War, during the populist rebellions of the mid-19th century. But today, in an age of instant communication, it is more difficult than ever to agree on a common set of facts. And I submit that what that means is that only by making a personal effort will we find the truth. As others concerned about where this leaves us have pointed out, democracy works best as a contest of ideas. But lacking agreement on basic facts, it can't function. Thank you, and I look forward to talking to you more about this as we go for questions.
Bill, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Very dense. And I hope you don't completely lose your voice. We've been filling up the chat with some questions. And I know I don't want to exclude people who can't use the chat function, but we do have several questions that Susan's going to read one by one, Bill. And let's answer those there first, and then I'll look in the audience after that. You guys can raise your hand and I'll unmute you if you have a burning question. So let's do the chat room first. Thanks, Susan.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks so much, Bill. I really found that to be a very interesting overview. From yellow journalism to fake news. So a couple of questions. Do you feel the way journalism is taught has changed?
That's an interesting question because I'm not really very current on how it's being taught at the moment. But I do know that there's much more effort being put into having journalists aware of other cultures. There was a time when I started, when there was really only, I don't know how to put this, sort of, in a way that isn't going to offend anybody, but when I started, it was really a white male culture. And again, the guys had all the answers, and it was viewed through that perspective only. And I think that one thing that is being taught today is that you can't see the world in just one silo, that there are so many cultures and different kinds of people. I think young journalists know that. And that's one reason for the kind of disruption that is occurring in places like the New York Times, which I mentioned in the cancel culture thing. When people get the idea that there are some things you shouldn't discuss. I don't believe that's true, but yes, I think there is a difference in the way things are being taught and learned.
Right. We have a couple that are sort of related. Somebody asked about the fairness doctrine being abolished and whether that has led us to where we're at, and what would is there a role for the FCC in controlling or in addressing the whole disinformation issue?
Not without the fairness doctrine. I mean, the fairness doctrine got knocked down in 1987, I believe. And that is what, actually, some of the obituaries for Rush Limbaugh have noted that it was only after the fairness doctrine went away that an opinion broadcast like his was able to get on the air. And there's no likelihood that it would ever come back.
Mhm.
And I don't think there's any real role for the FCC. The FCC has had oversight of the public airwaves because the construct is that they're public, that we all own them. But then what's happened? We're not communicating as much over those public airways. We're communicating over the internet and cable. And the FCC has no regulation over cable, over what is said on cable. So I don't think I doubt that there's any role in the future for a fairness doctrine. I just don't see anybody accepting it.
So one of the questions that's somewhat related is, should there be some sort of code of ethics for journalists, especially for networks where compensation packages are paid by advertising dollars?
It's a very good question, because there are codes of ethics. Every network, including the cable networks, has a code of ethics to which one must subscribe, agree to, as a condition of being hired. But unlike professional licensure for law or medicine or science, it has no teeth. The only enforcement is in the employer deciding that you crossed a line and disciplining or firing you. So the Society for Professional Journalism does indeed have a code of ethics. So does every major newspaper and television network.
Mhm.
There's the enforcement is the question, and the interpretation. There is no central authority.
So a lot of this then goes back to education and how do we get young people to be discerning, and what is the role of schools? What is the role of even established media outlets to make this an issue that people are aware of? There's a bias everywhere. How do we address that as a society?
Well, I think we start by admitting that there is bias everywhere and trying to check our own biases when we're trying to deal with facts. That's number one. Number two is in educating people, especially young people. We need to make an effort to have them understand that communication is not just about me being seen by you. Me doing I've got news to share with you on Facebook in 30 seconds. That there is content to be addressed, that there's critical thinking required to separate fact from fiction, to sort through what is going on in the world. I don't think we do a great job of that now, and I can only hope that the education of our younger people does improve. I mean, we all hope that, but
Yeah. Julie Gentry commented, wouldn't it be wonderful if every high school in the country could receive a copy of this recording?
if they paid attention, maybe.
Right. Yeah. Here's a question. Does Congress get accurate information?
Actually, Congress can get accurate information. The Congressional Research Service is an absolute marvel of conciseness and fact-based truth. It's what the members choose to do with it or not do with it that matters.
Right. To what extent, and we've got a lot of information in the chat room. A few people have shared some links to the fairness doctrine issues and some other points. So I urge you all to take a look through those. To what extent has the free nature of the internet contributed to the tsunami of non-news, infotainment, and sensationalism? Is there an educational and cultural problem in this country when 74 million Americans voted for 4 more years?
Well, the internet contributes to the spread of all kinds of information, good and bad. I mean, as we talked about, you can put anything out there and somebody will see it and they'll likely agree or disagree with it in seconds. So yes, absolutely, the internet is the reason that we have as much, I believe, is the reason we have as much disagreement and what do I want to say here? The reason we're so polarized, so separated, is because of the available information. But the question is, what do you do about it? You can't, if you're going to have any kind of freedom of speech or any kind of debate over issues, you can't shut down the internet. Not that anybody would, particularly since it's making so much money for the people who basically control it.
Yeah, well, and that, of course, raises the question of regulation of social media, which is a bit of a hot topic these days.
It's a very hot topic. And you've seen what is, you've all seen, I'm sure, what is going on in Australia, where the Australian government arguing with Facebook and Google about who pays for content. So Facebook has completely shut down content, news content, that Google is paying. And then in addition to that, there is the question of the so-called section, pardon me, 230, which again is a regulation for, is the question of who's responsible for what appears on the major providers of the internet, on Facebook and Google. In other words, at the moment, section 230, which was enacted 20 years ago, absolves Facebook or Google from any responsibility for whatever appears on their platform. The responsibility is that of the person who puts it up there and not of the platform for making it available. And that's under attack as well.
So here's a question. Is the journalistic standard of publishing or broadcasting something, if heard from 3 separate sources, too low? Could you discuss this? In
Three sources is usually more than we had.
Yeah.
Two would be often the case.
Right.
It's a standard that is not written in stone anywhere, but it's a good one. The more confirmation you have, obviously, the better it is. But it's too low, I don't think so. I mean, that raises the whole question of whether anonymous sourcing is that this comes up all the time. If somebody's not willing to put their name on something, why would you publish it? Well, it may be the only way you get the story.
Yeah.
And the Associated Press, for example, has a policy of not publishing anything that they can't put a name on. But occasionally, even they will have to do it in order to protect a source.
Is there an instance or example in world history, ancient or modern, of a society or culture that got this right?
That's a good one. I don't think so.
I don't think so either. I think it's a difficult one, especially the more outlets that are out there, the more there is opportunity for mischief. And back in the Roman days, they only had, you know, heralds and scribes. They didn't have internet. Disinformation permeates politics and public policy, but other areas as well, science, religion. Do you think education is the key to countering disinformation, or are there other avenues? What's the role of faith leaders? What's the role of other leaders other than politicians?
Leaders of all kinds, it seems to me, should be making an effort to dispel misinformation. Yes, it's a role of faith leaders or politicians. Do they do it well? Not always. But it's very important to keep trying. I mean, there's only so much you can do by educating kids in school. They have to learn they have to learn how life is sometimes before they see where the truth lies.
That's for sure. Okay, great. Okay, why did you go into journalism? That's a good one. What motivated you?
Well, I started out to be a lawyer. I went to law school for a while and decided I really didn't like it. So I quit. I got a job I had done some radio as an undergraduate. Got a job in television in Milwaukee, and became aware after a couple of years of a fellowship that CBS had in New York at Columbia, which I applied for and received. I started work on a master's degree in political science. I never got the degree because I was able to go to work immediately after the end of the first year at CBS.
Mm-hmm.
So I sort of stumbled into it that way, but I've loved it. I've loved every minute of being sort of in the front row as history is being made.
Well, you covered four presidents. Can you share any inside interesting stories about any of your experiences with those?
Well, you know, we hold, many people anyway, hold presidents in awe, hold the White House and all its trappings. And these people are human beings just like the rest of us. I've spent a lot of time on the campaign trail with them before they became president. And so you see them as human beings with an extraordinary amount of power. Sometimes they know how to use it and sometimes they don't. But you lose, it's important not to be overawed. You have to see them as other functioning human beings and judge them the same way you would your colleagues, your peers. They all had interesting personalities. I mean, Ronald Reagan, who was the first president I actually covered Jimmy Carter in his campaign, but not in the White House. And you get a sense of their personalities. I mean, Carter was and is a technocrat with a certain deep moral strain. And that was evident from the first time I saw him on the campaign trail in 1976. Reagan was a genial, easygoing guy, not at all difficult, and smarter than he appeared, but basically not very interested in being anybody but himself. But he had principles according to which he governed. With every one of them, you can point to weaknesses and faults. I mean, with Bush 41, it was very busy being not Ronald Reagan. Obama, well, from Clinton first. Clinton was hilariously funny at sometimes, but whip smart. Always needed to be loved. And Obama, same thing, whip smart. Thing about Obama was he disdained politics. Just didn't like politics. Never warmed up to Congress. All of this, was a disservice for him. George W. Bush, again, genial, easygoing, and not as stupid as some people thought. Not stupid really at all. Shrewd, but he knew that he was there because his name was Bush. I mean, as I say, they're all human.
Must have just been fascinating. Okay, how would you rate NPR and PBS for their objectivity and their listener viewership? Are they the bulwark defending responsible media, and should we be able to allocate tax dollars to them?
They do a good job. They're thorough. But when you compare them to commercial media, you can see the difference immediately. They are much less concerned with the headline that'll draw you in or keep you there. They do give you the facts. And sometimes that can seem boring, but it's still important.
Mm-hmm.
I think NPR particularly is casts a wide net and does a good job. It's and PBS. I mean, I think of the NewsHour, and here Judy is an old friend of mine, so I don't want to make it too personal, but the NewsHour is a 1960s television news broadcast, and that in a way is very good because it tells you a lot.
Yeah.
And we always watch. So
Great. Jan, maybe we have a few minutes to open it up to the general public. I do have one question that maybe Bill could address really quickly, and that is, what are you doing with your free time these days, other than serving as a member of the board of the Georgetown Village?
it's interesting. Probably like many of you, I don't have a whole lot of trouble keeping busy. There's always some little thing to do. I mean, even with the weather as lousy as it was last week, I don't get out that much, but I keep busy around the house. I write a little bit. I was busy working on these comments last week, but I keep up with family and friends. My wife and I, she's working from home as well, so we're able to spend a lot of time together, which is great. It's, I've said for the last year, it would be wrong for me to complain because there are so many people who are, who are suffering. I don't really think we're suffering.
Yeah. Thank
Well,
you.
the lucky one.
Let me ask that. We've got a couple people who got hands raised, which is great. And I've unmuted Gail Raymond. So Gail, go ahead, ask your question.
Okay, thank you, Bill, so much for doing this. This is a flashback for the Ford White House. I used to work for Bob Hartman, and I think I talked to you a couple times there, but I was, Bill Jones and I had conversations every single day right before going on air. And I appreciate your comments. I was kind of curious. I know through that whole going through Watergate, working for Ford, that we there was a problem with a lack of objectivity in many ways, as well as journalists who all wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein in terms of their approach. I don't know how much that has changed. Those certainly aren't the idols today, but I want your comments on that as well.
Well, I mean, there are still lots of reporters who would like to be seen asking a question in the briefing room, although even though the daily briefing is back in this new administration, there are not a lot of reporters in the room because of COVID. But yeah, there's a lot of grandstanding. There always was. In those days that you're talking about, there was a rule that you couldn't file any information during the briefing. Now, of course, it's on TV. So, and that is something that Mike McCurry, who instituted that during the Clinton administration, pardon me, now thinks was a mistake, but it was inevitable. It would have happened sooner or later anyway. Sure, I mean, reporters are as guilty as anybody else of seeking limelight and calling attention to themselves. And one way to do it is to be a nuisance during a briefing.
Thanks, Gail. Mary Stump have their hand up. Go ahead, guys.
Thanks. Thanks, Bill, for your presentation. And I want to go back to where we were talking sometime back about educating younger students and in building their critical thinking skills along these lines. And as a former middle school librarian, I worked with 8th grade students who had to prepare debates on controversial topics, and those changed over time, but they always had to learn both sides, and they had to do research in a variety of formats. And to prepare them for that, we always talked and used a particular acronym to help them, and it was a RADCAB, RADCAB. R for reliable, A for accuracy, D for direct versus indirect sourcing, currency, C for currency, up to date, A for authority, who's is this person or vehicle authoritative and have expertise, and the B is for bias, what is the slant that's being presented to you. So we try. How much of it actually sinks in, the future will tell us, but
I think that's great. I'm so glad that that's going on.
yeah, it is. So, but thank you for your presentation today, Bill.
You're most welcome.
Thank you. And I'm just going to glance at anybody want to raise their physical hand that I can see that may have one more question, because we're getting at the top of the hour. I'm just going to cruise through and try and notice people. Oh, I see Patricia Chatton. And I'm going to ask you to unmute. If you can unmute yourself, Patricia, then go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
I'm the other face in the Patricia Chatton box.
Yeah, it just says Patricia, so I went with,
That's fine. No, that's
I
fine.
guess it might be Mr. Chatton then.
I spent 28 years in U.S. Information Agency, and before that was a daily newspaper person in 2 papers. And we always operated on the importance of foreign public opinion impact upon American interests. What is your experience in how the people you covered cared at all as to how we're perceived abroad?
You mean the presidents?
I'm sorry?
The presidents? Do you mean the presidents?
No, presidents in the United States in general. I found, for example, very often that foreign perception of the United States in general has a lot to do with our largest current presence there. The drug trade speaks loudly about that.
Yeah, I mean, there is in most of American commercial broadcasting, there is very little coverage of overseas news. And when something major happens, like the coup in Myanmar, formerly Burma, or a flood and the big flood in Turkey, then there will be some pictures, but that's about it. We collectively don't pay much attention to what the rest of the world thinks of us, which I believe is a mistake. The new foreign policy team in this White House seems intent on rebuilding some of those relationships, and that's good. But most Americans have never paid a whole lot of attention to what's going on overseas unless they have family or commercial interests. I agree with you. It's a shame.
Does the fact that most Americans don't pay much attention to it, is that sentiment reflected among the politicians and you have covered?
Most of them, yes. There are some who, for their own various reasons, are interested in what's going on in the rest of the world. For example, members of the Foreign Affairs Committee generally are pretty good about knowing what's happening. And the people in the National Security Council always cared and noticed. But by and large, people don't pay any attention.
We've got another question coming from Seal Garrett over at Alexandria.
Hi, Bill. I'm curious to know what your own what does a typical day look like for you in terms of where you get your news?
I get most of it I get most of it online, and I still get 3 physical newspapers. I get the Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, and I get the Politico feed and the Axios feed. I assume that most of you are probably somewhat familiar with those blogs. And I listen to, NPR comes on in the morning. I don't watch television in the morning. I do watch the CBS broadcast at night just to see who's doing what. And then we watch the news hour. But I get most of my news off the websites of the Times and the Post. I read magazines. I get The Economist, the New Yorker. It's a fairly typical diet for someone my age.
No, I think that's helpful. I know a lot of our members, curious where you get your news from, and it sounds like a variety of sources, which is kind of the point of this too. Look around. So.
Well, yeah, it's important, I think, to get different perspectives, no matter whether you agree or not. To read the article, to read the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, and then read the editorial page of the Times. And you'll get a different perspective.
Yeah, very good. Again, I don't want.
Do you have another? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jen.
No, go ahead, Susan.
I just wanted to say that we're getting an awful lot of wonderful thank you notes in the chat room. So I just wanted to, before we signed off, to make sure that Bill knows. Thank you for the very valuable interpretation of journalism today, how we got where we are. Intelligent and stimulating talk. So people are very appreciative of this talk today, Bill.
Thank you for that very much. It's been my great pleasure to do it. I apologize for the fact that my voice was giving out, but other than that, it was great fun.
Yeah, thank you so much. I wanted to say too, I got an email while we were going that we had posted this on a shared villages site, and there may have been a problem with the link. So if those, I brought in several people very late to the game, and I think because we had an incorrect link. So I put in the chat, but I wanted to let anyone know we have recorded this session. and it will be made available. And if you need to reach out to me, I'm Jan Buchanan at the director at mountvernonathome.org, all spelled out. But you can look up on the website for me too, or Mount Vernon at Home. Get in touch with me or your village director if you're for one of the other villages, and let me know, and I will get the link to you so you don't miss a thing. So I apologize if that was the case. So anyway, Bill, rest your voice. What an engaging and wonderful presentation. I know we'll all be talking about it for days to come. You've given us some good things to think about, good ways for us to look at news, to keep at it, to be skeptical, but also be curious, and appreciate knowing the depth and breadth of your experience, and for you taking the time to talk with all of us today. Thank you so very much. And thank you and others for coming out today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all
Enjoy
very
the
much.
rest of the day. Keep at it with the vaccine. Let's go. Let's get vaccinated. Let's get back out there.
Woohoo!
Yep. Take care,
Bill.
everyone.
Bill,
Bye-bye.
it's-
Bye.
Bill, before you turn off, this is Wendy, who talked to you earlier about the fact that we both haven't used our fireplaces. There's
Oh,
one
right.
more thing. There's one more thing it appears we have in common. The light fixture behind you, the black one, that's the balanced light fixture.
It's here,
I've
yeah.
got it. I've got it as well. I own that same light. So clearly there's some connection that you and I have that is
Obviously.
not apparent to all of us.
Take care,
Thank you.
everyone. Thanks
Thank
again,
you.
Bill. Take care of your voice. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Jan. Great job.
Yep. Thank you. Good work, everyone.